You know what's almost as bad as the Somali welfare fraud scandal? Governor Tim Walz trying to explain away the Somali welfare fraud scandal.
Do you want to hear more from members and leaders from the Somali community to say, we need to look at ourselves, we need to hold our own neighbors accountable, because look at the damage that this has done to our community. What do you want to hear more from, instead of just saying, don't blame us? Do you want to see more ownership and oversight from within the Somali?
Look, it's not law-abiding citizens. If that were the case, there's a lot of white men should be holding a lot of white men accountable for the crimes that they have committed.
Hey everyone, I'm Lowry of National Review, and Tim Walz wants to minimize and dance around this scandal for a couple reasons. One, really embarrassing to him and a commentary on the competence of his administration. Two, it undermines a key ideological premise of the left, which is that all immigrants are wonderful and all immigrants are equal, which is why he tries to bring up white people a lot when he talks about this.
So I think it's asking us then, for every crime, which of course the majority being committed by white men, asking us to do more about that. I think it's crime in general.
All right, this is very dumb. Somalis are about 80,000 people in the state of Minnesota. That is an overall population of nearly 6 million. Of course, they're not committing the majority of crimes. No one is saying that. And by the way, I don't know what category of crime the governor is thinking of, but if you look at homicides, the vast majority of homicides in Minnesota are committed by African American males. But let's put that aside. He's just looking for any way to minimize this fraud story. Here's another way he tries to do it.
This is 80 people or so that have been convicted in this, maybe some more in that, out of a broader ring. Medicaid fraud will stretch across all racial demographics, all ethnic groups.
So what he's saying there is that only 80 people have been convicted. That doesn't mean that only 80 people were involved in this fraud or knew about this fraud. And if you flip it around and look at it another way, you see another story, right? Because about 90% of the people involved in this fraud that we know about were Somalis. That would seem to be a problem. This wasn't a minor affair. This was one of the largest welfare frauds at the state level in American history. This is the largest pandemic era fraud that we know about. But Walz wants us to believe that there's nothing other Somalis could have done. They shouldn't have blown the whistle on this. There was no reason they should have policed their own community and informed authorities earlier and more clearly about what was going on.
But no, I think this idea that the Somali community is to blame for this because they didn't do more, I think that's how we got into this.
That's pathetic. When there's been such widespread fraud, such a huge fraud scheme in a tight-knit community with an ethnic element, it is incumbent on members of that community, leaders of that community, to speak out and denounce it in the most forceful terms possible. Instead, we've basically heard nothing, zero, zilch from Somali leaders in Minnesota, with very few exceptions. Even the New York Times has pointed this out. In his big piece on this a while ago, the Times quoted someone named Kesa Magan, I'm probably messing up the pronunciation, a Somali American who formerly worked as a fraud investigator for the Minnesota Attorney General's office, and noted he, quote, is among the few prominent figures in the Somali community to speak out about the fraud, close quote. Has Tim Walz just not noticed this phenomenon? Does he not care? Does it not bother him? By the way, this ethic of protection in other immigrant communities has been recognized by most of us as a very bad thing.
Fredo, you're my older brother, and I love you. But don't ever take sides with anyone against the family again.
What Walz would never acknowledge and finds inherently hateful is what's obviously true. There was a cultural element to this fraud. The aforementioned Somali American fraud investigator quoted by the New York Times wrote a fascinating piece hitting on this. He points out that unlike in the wider American society, increasingly distrustful and fractured, Somalis inherently trust one another, and that creates an opening for fraudsters. Now, the conduit for the fraud is the recipients. The providers take advantage of the recipients. And he points out Somali recipients face language and cultural barriers. In an unfamiliar country, they lean heavily on other Somalis, and that trust is there to be taken advantage of. Somali recipients are often courted by Somali providers based on clan ties and familial relations, not necessarily the quality of the service. This relationship, which blurs the traditional boundaries between a recipient and provider, can enable fraud. Legitimate providers say it can be challenging to keep recipients because some rival providers offer kickbacks to induce recipients to switch. Fear of ostracism can prevent recipients from reporting fraud or cooperating with investigators. The close community bond also magnifies information sharing, so once folks have figured out a way to defraud these programs, word spreads and others get into the act. Now, acknowledging all that would seem very important to making sure it doesn't happen again, but Tim Walz has other ideas, other potential solutions.
I think we continue to educate folks about why they shouldn't commit crimes.
Yeah, sure, that will do it. Let's just tell them that it's wrong to commit crimes in America. This is really important information we need to share. Now, look, another aspect of the story that Tim Walz would never acknowledge, even though it's true, is that Somalis are having a really hard time assimilating into America and have massively disproportionate welfare usage. Jason Richwine of the Great Center for Immigration Studies just published a report on this. According to the report, more than half of children in Somali immigrant homes in Minnesota live in poverty, while only 8% of children in native-headed homes are in poverty. 1 in 8 children in poverty in Minnesota lives in a Somali immigrant home. About 39% of working-age Somalis have no high school diploma. The number for the native-born is 5%. Among working-age adult Somalis who've lived in the U.S. for more than 10 years, half still can't speak English, quote, very well. About 54% of Somali-headed households in Minnesota receive food stamps, and 73% of Somali households have at least one member on Medicaid. Comparable figures for the native-born, 7% and 18%. Nearly every Somali household with children receives some form of welfare, 89%. Now, let's look at this through some tables and charts. Poverty rates, adults in poverty, the rate among natives, 6.9%, rate among Somali immigrants, 37.5%, rate among Somali immigrants in the U.S. more than 10 years, 32.9%. Now, welfare use rates among native households, Somali immigrant households, and Somali immigrant households that have been here more than 10 years. You see the stark disparity when it comes to all welfare programs, cash, food stamps, and Medicaid. Then there's welfare usage by households with children. Again, stark disparity. Any welfare program, 89% of Somali immigrant households with children, as just mentioned a minute ago, and 86% among Somali immigrant households with children that have been here more than 10 years. Now, none of this is to suggest that all this welfare usage is fraudulent. Of course not. The fact of the matter is that we have a welfare system that is set up to benefit low-skilled people with children, and that characterizes overwhelmingly the Somali immigrant community in the United States. Now, you might say, why just can't we build a moat around our welfare system and preserve it and make its benefits available just to the native born? But as Jason Richwine points out, this is totally unrealistic in at least two ways. One, we're not going to let poor immigrants come into the United States and then see them starve in our country. No one is going to tolerate that politically. No one wants to see that. Two, these immigrants very often are accessing these programs through their children who are often born in the United States, making them citizens and meaning that they can totally legitimately get these welfare benefits, and there's no way to exclude them. The answer here is to be much more selective in who we are letting into the country. We can afford to be choosy in our immigration policy. We can have immigrants who overwhelmingly have the attributes and skills necessary to assimilate really quickly in this country and to thrive really quickly in this country. But that is another heresy for the likes of Governor Tim Walz. He is a doofus. He is out of touch with reality. And like many people on his side of the aisle, it is totally impermissible for him to think rationally about immigration policy. I'm Rich Lowry, over and out.